Jon Huntsman Jr., former ambassador to Russia, China, Singapore, former presidential candidate, and former governor of the state of Utah. Thank you so much for coming back to Three Questions.
Thank you, Bob. That's one heck of an introduction. I appreciate that. You make me sound good already.
Well, for those folks who don't know, you were our very first guest on Three Questions way back in the day.
I was your guinea pig.
Yes, you were.
I felt it at the time.
You were the canary in the coal mine, is what you were. And we're so grateful that you lived through that experience.
Well, delighted to be able to rejoin you.
Since last we spoke, you have been sharpening your saw. You have been out on the international diplomacy scene in both China and Russia. And since then, now your saw is sharp. You had an awful lot of credibility back when we first spoke. Now you have even more. And now you're back in Utah. What are you going to do here? Are you going to run for governor?
Well, we're giving that a lot of consideration right now. You have to proceed in a way that says, if you do it, do you add value or do you add dead weight? So I'm not somebody who believes in adding dead weight to public service. I believe in public service. It's been part of who we are as a family. I think we'll always believe in public service, but it always has to be associated with how can you bring value or goodness to whatever it is you're trying to do. Otherwise, don't waste your time.
In trying to decide whether to run for governor, what are the specific factors that you are weighing? You're talking about adding value, but what specifically are you talking about?
Well, first you have to say, is it good for your family? Because family is the centerpiece of our existence. You know, is it something that Mary Kay wants to do? Because being a first lady, as we know, is a big part of it, and she did such a great job. So you check that box and say, okay, that's good. That was a positive. Mm-hmm. And your kids have to take the ride too. So you have to say, are you in or not? And you have to have very frank conversations with all of them. Some of my kids don't much like politics, so you have to check in with them to see if it's okay. And then you have to say, okay, with Utah at a pivot point, at an inflection moment, do you have the skill set and do you have the understanding of the most important issues that we'll face around the bend to be able to provide the leadership and the policy value added to where you can leave the state ahead as opposed to behind once you leave the job, if you choose to do it. So all of those things have to be factored into the mathematical equation, so to speak.
Utah's political and economic footprint is nowhere near the size of, say, a California or New York or even Texas. And considering your incredible resume, and with apologies to those who want to raise Utah's profile on the international scene, isn't aiming at the governor's seat for you now with your resume aiming just a little low?
No, I would argue that if you believe in pure public service, you say, how can you best use your time to affect change, to lift lives, to leave a state you love better than you found it? So we have an opportunity in Utah to punch, as we always have, to punch way above our weight. So you look at the 50 states, you look at the major metropolitan areas, particularly in the West, a lot of them are dying on the vine. They've lost their competitiveness, their educational systems are failing, the air you can't breathe, people are leaving. So the real race today is going to be, how do you create a civilization that is a rapidly growing civilization that is sustainable, that can withstand the challenges of tomorrow and the years ahead, and provide the kinds of opportunities for kids and grandkids that are really going to be important. So you say, in the spectrum of public service, it might be returning to a position you've had before, if you were to do that. But the work is forward-leaning and it's focused on the future. And that, to me, as a public servant, is where the real value lies.
The prospect of the inland port and its development here in Utah and in the Salt Lake Valley, and indeed all around Utah, for that matter, how much does that influence whether you're going to run for governor?
Well, it's all part of our whole economic development model. So we're a hot economy. We have been for some time. We're going to hit some buffeting winds in the future. There's no doubt about that. But to see Utah as the centerpiece for regional trade, for services, for the flow of goods, for the jobs that are created around that sort of logistical function, is a really exciting prospect. But how do you do that in the context of clean air, leaving land as you should leave it, and in putting down your bets in places that are going to be a part of tomorrow's growth, not yesterday's growth. So that all has to be looked at very carefully, but conceptually, the idea that we can up our game to that extent, to be a regional, even a global center of trade, has been around for a long time, at least since the 1970s. So it's an idea that's worth pursuing, but the pieces have to be right.
In developing the inland port in at least northern Utah, if not all over the state, what would you bring to the table in helping to develop that and make that happen?
Well, probably a couple of things. Maybe a sense of global commerce, where the marketplace is and where it's going and what we need in order to succeed. So this isn't just a state game, it's a regional game and it's a global game. Second is, in order to make the inland port successful, whatever it becomes, you have to be a convener of people. People of all points of view, diverse points of view, and you have to get them together in an environment that speaks to respect of all points of view, and you have to move people toward a decision, toward an endpoint. And that's what I've done a good part of my career. And you do that as a governor, you do that as a diplomat, you do that as a dad. And that's something I would also bring to the table.
There are very few people out there in national politics right now that could challenge your international and foreign policy experience. And there are very few who have run a state as economically successful and successful in other ways as well. I mean, you are already a political leader for the future of this country. What is it that is keeping you from running for president again?
Bob, I'm not an entertainer. And I found the last go around that in order to run for president, it's not about what you know, what you've done, your views on the issues, the strengths or weaknesses that you bring to the table. It's about how well you entertain the crowds. And it's about the emotions of politics, not the sort of real delivery of politics. And I'm not really good at that, truth be told. And I don't much enjoy that. So I'm not very interested in pursuing that level of politics. I've tried it once, and I'd rather be where the action is and where the models of tomorrow can be produced and done with people that you enjoy being with.
The last time you and I spoke in this setting, you mentioned that there is a difference between talking about what needs to be done and then translating that talk into meaningful action and moving forward. The difference between campaigning and governing. Looking at our current president, Donald Trump, what kind of marks would you give him in that regard?
Well, he telegraphed much of what he's doing today during the campaign. So I give him high marks as someone who has been consistent in terms of what they talked about doing, what they said they were going to do, and what they've tried to deliver on now that they're in elected office. Few presidents in recent history have talked about dealing with immigration, dealing with international trade issues that don't benefit us, bringing an end to the endless wars in the Middle East, and keeping an eye focused on economic performance. And so much of what he talked about, credit to him, because I wasn't always a great supporter. And criticized him, particularly in 2012, as he reminded me when he asked me to go to Russia. Mm-hmm. And he remembered every bad thing I'd ever said about him. And I said, but you said some bad things about me too. He said, but I've forgiven you, that's okay. And maybe it comes out of his background as a developer, as a brash New York City developer. He's a business person who's never been in politics before. He doesn't understand the language of politics. He doesn't speak the language of politics. He said he was going to do something. He's tried, and his reelection will be up in about a year, and we'll see what happens.
The economy notwithstanding, and the attention to some of the issues that he brought up in the campaign, and such as immigration and trade and that kind of thing, there are those that are concerned that somehow he has diminished the office of the presidency just by being the way he is, a brash businessman from Queens. Do you agree? And should Americans be paying attention to that?
He's brash, he's boisterous, he's bellicose, he's all of that. And he was all of that during the campaign. So all I can say is people shouldn't be surprised by what they're experiencing today, because it was all telegraphed during the campaign. And this is a style that I could see coming when I was involved in 2012. in national politics. I could sense with the buildup and the frustration of a lot of the grassroots political players that they were looking for strength. They were looking for somebody who would provide new language and new descriptions to the issues that we face and new solutions ultimately. And I figured that there was an opening a mile wide for someone like a Donald Trump eventually. And here we are.
President Trump asked you to take over as the U.S. ambassador to Russia right as the relations between the U.S. and Russia were kind of spiraling down to a low point in the last few decades.
Right.
How difficult was that for you, and what specifically were the challenges that you faced?
I remember getting a call from the president in August 2017, just before my confirmation hearing. And he said, your job has just gotten infinitely more difficult. This is when sanctions were applied, and Congress basically took over ownership of all the sanctions, of which there are almost 900 today, toward individuals and entities in Russia. And he was right. You know, it was, when I left to take the job, mission impossible. And we tried to make it a mission possible. We haven't seen a bilateral relationship that has seen so much destruction back and forth. I don't think in recent history you can go well into the Cold War before you find another example of where we kicked so many diplomats out of each other's embassies and consulates and saw this kind of deterioration in the bilateral relationship. But it was done for a reason. It was done because of election meddling in 2016, which was very real. It was done because of the Russians' poisoning of a citizen in the UK, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia. And for the overall malign activities that have been promulgated against our friends and allies in Europe. These are very real issues, to say nothing of the incursions into eastern Ukraine, where there's an ongoing civil war and people still dying almost every day. So if the United States doesn't respond, nobody's going to respond.
Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin and came out and said, I believe him, when he says there was no meddling in the 2016 election. Is Vladimir Putin worthy of that kind of trust from not only President Trump, but any U.S. president?
I've heard the president say that that he believes there was meddling in 2016, and I think that's where he is. Now, he'll say things in some cases for different audiences, and I'm not going to parse that. I'll leave that to the political scientists and the historians. But the intelligence is pretty clear in terms of what the Russians did in 2016 and what they're prepared to do in the future. And we saw just a small kind of glimpse of ultimately what could wreak major havoc in our elections. And I'm talking not just about national elections, but I'm talking about our local elections as well. Infiltrating individual voter registration files, manipulating the data associated with local election outcomes, stuff that could cause total turmoil and ultimately anarchy in local politics. This is what we could be up against if we are not aware of what they're capable of doing. And I'm not talking just about the Russians. I'm talking about 3 or 4 other countries as well that have a similar capability and a similar desire to want to trip us up as a country.
China being one of them,
China being one of them. Yes, indeed.
Where else?
The Iranians have this capability. They have that malign capability. The Cubans are pretty good at it as well. And there are other sort of offshoot organizations that aren't necessarily allied with nation states that are more movements, political movements that increasingly have that capability as well.
How well did you get to know Vladimir Putin, and what kind of a man is he?
I got to know him to the point where I could look at him across the table.
In the eye?
In the eyes. And he would look at me, and I knew that he was thinking probably what I was thinking, and that was, what does he know about? I know he's been reading a whole lot about me. What does he know about me? And he was thinking the same thing. That's the world he lives in. He came up as an intelligence operative, and he'll want to know more about the person sitting across from him at the table than they know about themselves. He'll want to know about how a meeting's going to end even before it starts. He's very, very shrewd. He's unassuming. He's a short guy who walks in a room and you hardly know he's there. He'll sit at a table and in a very sort of understated, almost a whisper of a speak, he'll carry out a dialogue, but you know exactly that he knows where that dialogue is going. He's done it for 20 years. He's seen every head of state. He knows every negotiating style, and he knows exactly how he's going to get what he wants from you out of you.
Does he speak English?
He likes to remind you that he does, because he'll correct his interpreter every now and again and say, no, I meant to say this, just to get in your head.
Wow. You served under 3 U.S. presidents, President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump.
President Reagan as well.
And President Reagan. Okay, so
and the
4.
Other President Bush.
Yeah. So 5 altogether.
Yeah.
So you served under 5 U.S. presidents. Can you compare for me their leadership styles and how healthy those leadership styles are for not only domestic governance, but our effects overseas and with our foreign allies and friends?
Styles are all pretty dramatically different, and they all tend to match the needs of the time historically. So President Reagan, who I loved, and I was an advance man for him, so I got to see him up close and personal as he'd travel around in the early 1980s. And he was there to pick up a lot of the doldrums that we'd experienced in the late 70s, the malaise of the 70s, the twin towers of high interest rates and high inflation that was killing our economy, to bring new hope and new optimism to the country. And he was truly a cheerful and sunny individual. He was just irrepressible in terms of his optimism. It was real. It was him. And he was followed by George H.W. Bush, who was vice president, of course, and schooled in the art of statecraft. He'd been CIA director. He'd been our envoy to China. And I remember having this conversation with him when I returned from China, because we had lunch together. He said, of all the jobs I've had, chairman of the Republican National Committee, head of the CIA, ambassador to the UN, ambassador to China, vice president, president, China was my most enjoyable job. And so we shared that in common. We lived in the same home, and as I told him, our dogs probably relieved themselves on the same tree out front. And Barbara was there, and it was a lot of fun. But he brought to the job the skills of a technocrat, because that's what he was. He didn't have the effervescent personality of Ronald Reagan, nor the connection with the grassroots, but he knew how the world worked in a very interesting way. And then along came George W., who was on the far end of Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was a phenomenon that sort of matched the doldrums that we experienced in the late 80s and early 90s, with an economy that was sputtering a little bit. And he promised a bridge to the future in very optimistic, almost Reagan-esque terms. And of all the presidents, Bill Clinton was probably among the most gifted in terms of his ability to do politics, retail politics, connect with people, and give speeches. A very eloquent guy. I mean, these are people I don't agree with politically, but I've watched and marveled at their political skills. And he was replaced by his opposite, and mostly presidents are replaced by their opposite, because the people get tired of what they had, they trade it in for the new model.
Right.
And then came George W., who was far different, although generationally they were the same. He was a plain-spoken guy. He didn't speak long, but what he said was right to the point, and he was there on time, and he was a very practiced governor. He was a very successful governor who brought us that sense of compassionate conservatism that sort of carried the day for a little while. And he brought in a really good team of people. I think that's what made him a very unique politician. And at the end of George W., we got just the opposite of him with Barack Obama.
Yeah. Very intellectual.
Who was a historical figure in the sense that breaking the sound barrier with ethnicity, but a scholar, an academic. That's what he was. And someone who read his briefing books, who understood the issues, who took great interest in the issues, almost to the extent that Jimmy Carter did. Jimmy Carter is probably the last example of a president who was really that focused intellectually on the work. And he had his time, and then of course we get the complete opposite of Barack Obama with Donald Trump.
Yeah, some would say it's the extreme opposite.
It's the extreme opposite. But you know, if you look at the cycles of history, that's typically what the people want. Whether it's, you know, the end of Eisenhower into a young Kennedy, into a Nixon, into a Carter, into a Reagan. They're always kind of looking for what they lacked the last little while, which is what the free enterprise system of our democracy is all about. People choose. People are in control.
Yeah. Thank goodness. The impeachment inquiry, is it warranted or is it not?
Well, I think an airing of some of the details certainly needs to be heard. So the idea that we're bringing forth some of the allegations, when you have a whistleblower, that's a serious thing in our system. And that means you got to hear them out, you got to look at the evidence and see where it all leads. What I would hate to see is a political rush to impeachment. Impeachment is a very solemn thing. Enshrined in our Constitution in terms of how it plays out. And it's only been done 3 times in our country's history. And I fear that we're going to see a tit for tat play out. Well, you did it to my president, I'm going to do it to your president. So the minute they're elected, you look for how you're going to impeach them. That would result in a total failure of executive leadership, and it would be politics all the time.
Is that where we are? Is that where we are?
I hate to think that's where we are, but here's the deal, Bob. We have an election 1 year away. The most powerful tool that we have in politics is the ballot box. And it would be a great thing to bring the allegations forward and whatever evidence there is, and to remind people that we are soon months away from a major presidential election, and put it in the hands of the people. Let them determine the result.
In the most recent poll, the majority of Utahns are dissatisfied with President Trump's performance in office. Should he be reelected?
Well, we'll see. That'll be up to the American people.
In your view?
Well, when you look at the results, I think you have to differentiate, because I think a lot of folks in this state, because I know politics in this state, I know a lot of people in this state, I think they look at the attitude part of it, the personality part of it. And I think that rebuffs them a little bit. The way that Trump does business, the way that he calls people out, the way that he tweets, the way that he picks fights, seemingly so randomly. We haven't seen that in a president, maybe not since Andrew Jackson. And Twitter wasn't around during Andrew Jackson's time, so we don't know how people responded back then. So that's one part of it. The other part is stewardship of the economy. It's conduct of foreign affairs, which, you know, you can argue a lot of different ways. He's the first president to go after China on trade complaints. We've known there have been violations of China's trade obligations for years, but nobody's ever thought to go after them because they're still growing. And by the way, we need to let them mature and become more like us. Well, we're finding in both the case of the Chinese and the Russians, they're not inclined to want to become more like us. They're their own model, their own nation state, their own culture. And we're going to be in conflict with them for as far as the eye can see into the future. We'll collaborate, but we'll also have serious moments of conflict. And the key will be, do you have a chief executive who can avoid war?
There is an article in a recent article in Vanity Fair that I hope you've had an opportunity to take a look at. It alleges that with negative or positive comments, President Trump is able to influence the markets based on the U.S.-China trade war. And somebody is making a tremendous amount of money when he does that. What do you make of that?
Do you remember when Bill Clinton was in office and he said, when I'm reincarnated, I want to be a bond trader? Because he knew himself the power of the presidency. And you could make one statement, and the markets, whether equities or whether bonds or whether the currency markets, would go crazy, up or down or all around. That's just the nature of the free economy that we have. It's been supercharged with President Trump, with a lot of the international incidents that have played out, and with the way that he's so vocally and by way of Twitter handled his execution of foreign policy. So the markets go up 700 one day, they go down 500 the next. And now the trade war with the 2 largest economies of the world, both of them, you know, near or just over $20 trillion, China and the United States. Massive, massive movements in the equity markets, in the currency markets, in the debt markets. It's absolutely incredible. So does President Trump have a feel for how that works? Of course. I know the school that he went to, and of course he studied that. But every president has a pretty good feel for what their statements are going to do to the marketplace. In fact, I've seen evidence with other presidents of where they will say, where's the market now? And after they make a speech, where's the market now? knowing full well that during their speech or after their announcement, it's going to move the market substantially.
From what you've been able to gather, is he purposely manipulating the markets?
I don't have any evidence of that.
President Trump called the U.S. troops back from Syria. He's gotten them out of there and has been criticized for that. Now he's announced there's a permanent ceasefire between Turkey and the Kurds in northern Syria. Are you confident that that ceasefire will hold, number one, and number two, who wins and who loses in this equation?
Well, it's a little bit like asking for a permanent ceasefire here in Utah during the deer hunting season. Probably not going to happen. Probably not going to happen when you look at the people involved and the complexity of the politics. So you've got the most complicated issues of foreign policy all playing out in northern Syria. You've got ethnicity, you have religion, and you have borders. And they're all there on public display for all to see. We have been a factor in Syria. So the civil war has been ongoing, Bob, for eight years, almost 9 years now. 500,000 dead. We don't stop to think about that. And you've got groups that have been at each other for centuries that are continuing their conflict in Syria for a lot of different reasons. It all kind of started with the Arab Spring movement of 2011, where a lot of Middle Eastern states were impacted by technology and how it allowed people to gather and protest against the existing order. And they haven't recovered from that. So we have been in. We were to go in for a brief period of time. We've been in for a very long period of time. We haven't lost a lot of soldiers because most of our mission there is non-kinetic. We're not shooting. Rather, we're training. We are equipping. We're sharing intelligence, and we're giving target coordinates to the SDF, the YPK, the Syrian Kurds, and others. While at the same time we're running pretty regular bombing missions from the Gulf into northeastern Syria, where you've got remnants of al-Nusra and ISIS. So I suspect that will continue because those bombing operations have gone on for years and they've been pretty consistent and they've been pretty effective. The troops on the ground have been more of a training variety. So now they're going to be called out, put next door in Iraq, where we have tens of thousands still, and they'll be part of a rapid deployment capability if in fact we need them. What I worry about, and again, the idea that this is going to end anytime soon is nonsense. It's not going to end anytime soon in Syria. The hole is too deep and the politics are too complicated. And the government of Damascus is too weak under Assad right now. So who controls it? And who has controlled it, truth be told, for a number of years? The Russians and the Iranians through their proxy Hezbollah. Make no mistake about it. They've controlled the battlefield with the exception of the northeast and the Euphrates River Valley, where we basically find ourselves. Our goal has been one thing, to get rid of ISIS. And we need to continue that obligation to get rid of them and make sure that, like a metastasizing cancer cell, they don't begin to circulate and kill the body. And so we're going to have to remain vigilant there, no question about it.
Your father's passing has affected, it left a huge hole in this community and in the world. Certainly, Huntsman Corporation and the Huntsman Cancer Institute will go forward. They're in good hands, and the mission is going to be continued. Can you quantify, can you qualify your father's contribution to this community and to the world in general?
Well, he left a hole in my heart, too, and a lot of others, for that matter.
Mine included.
It's unquantifiable. What impact a human being can have when they dedicate their life to building an enterprise and then dedicating the proceeds of that enterprise to the community, which is effectively what's happened. So the foundation which we have organized is really the recipient of a lot of work over the last generation to build a business, and then to put the proceeds into a foundation that will go toward good causes, first and foremost cancer. But we're going to broaden and expand that out in ways that I think would make him proud. I had my last conversation with him from Moscow when he said he was moving toward the end. And I wasn't prepared for that, because when you call somebody from Moscow, you got people listening in. It isn't a private conversation. And I told him ahead of time, I said, when we talk, we're not going to be alone.
Yeah.
And so how do you have a final conversation with your dad when you've got other people on the line? It becomes really tough. And that was my final conversation. I promised him I'd get back here in time for his passing. And I knew it was just a matter of hours, maybe a day or two. We got on a plane and we arrived, drove straight to his home, and we're 10 minutes away, and my brother called and said he just passed. So one of my great laments is I wasn't able to give him a hug before he passed. And that was kind of hard. So why do we do what we do? And why are we thinking about doing what we're thinking about doing? Because when a great dad passes, and we all have great dads and great moms, you begin to think about how many years you have left and how many productive years you have left. And within those years, what really is of value to you? How do you want to spend those years? What is meaningful in your life? Because the one thing my dad taught is you fight all the way to your last breath. Whatever it is you believe in, you fight to your last breath. And he had some famous punching matches and took on a lot of people, and I love that about him. He was a street fighter, and I was a diplomat. I could put out some of the fights every now and again. That's where I first got my training.
Yeah.
But it was in the aftermath of his passing, and with a couple of boys deployed now in the military, and grandkids coming up, where you stop to think, this is a big, complicated, confusing world, and we're not going to be around forever. Life is too short to hate. So how can you provide a little more love to people and communities where you're operating? And what do you want to do? So that takes us to where we are today, and our thought process toward ultimately making a decision and an announcement, I hope in the next couple of weeks.
As a husband, as a father, as a diplomat, as a government leader, you have seen an awful lot of this world. What is the one thing that mothers and fathers should teach their children in this day and age?
Love, unconditional love. Understanding other points of view, which is part of unconditional love. So the more I travel, the more I deal with foreign parties, the more I deal with domestic parties, your neighbor, the more you realize how similar we are, but how different we are. And our points of view matter, and they should be respected, and in order to respect them, they should be understood. That's all part of the American contract. You know, it's e pluribus unum. It's out of many one. And I think we forget that sometimes. We are built to be a diverse country, diverse points of view, but we're only going to survive long term if we can apply that unconditional love one to another. You don't have to agree with what your neighbor preaches, but you can certainly understand it and put yourself in their shoes and have a civil conversation that allows you to carry on. And if this world had a little more unconditional love, even in Syria, we'd be a much better place.
Jon Huntsman Jr., former ambassador to Russia, China, Singapore, former presidential candidate, and former governor of Utah. Thank you so much.
And failed keyboard player.
Not in the slightest.
But we'll get together and put that to the test.
That'll
right,
be fun. Thanks so much for being part of Three Questions.
Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.